There's always something strange about moving into a new neighborhood. You don't know the people, the streets, or the sounds of the night. For Katie and her husband Mark, this was supposed to be a fresh start. They had just bought a cozy 2-story house on the edge of a small town. The neighborhood seemed friendly and quiet, just what they wanted. The house next door was old and weathered, with peeling paint and a yard full of dead plants. It stood out in the otherwise well-kept neighborhood. Katie noticed it the first time they drove up the street. "Looks abandoned," Mark had said. But Katie wasn't so sure. A few days after they moved in, Katie was in the backyard planting flowers when she heard something. A loud creak, like an old door being forced open. She looked up to see an older man standing in the yard of the rundown house. He was staring at her. Katie waved hesitantly. "Hi, I'm Katie. We just moved in." The man didn't respond. He just kept staring. He had a long, scruffy beard, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. After a long, uncomfortable moment, he nodded once and shuffled back into the house. When Mark got home that evening, Katie told him about the encounter. "He's probably just shy," Mark said. "Or maybe he's not used to having neighbors." But Katie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. That night, Katie woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, like someone walking slowly outside. She nudged Mark. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark groaned. "It's probably a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep." But Katie couldn't. Got up and peeked out the window. The street was dark and empty, but when she looked at the neighbor's house, she thought she saw movement behind one of the upstairs windows. She told herself it was just her imagination. Over the next few nights, the noises continued. Footsteps, whispers, and once, a loud thud that made her jump out of bed. Mark insisted it was just the house settling or animals, but Katie wasn't convinced. Katie decided to bake some cookies and bring them to the neighbor. She thought maybe he was lonely and just needed someone to reach out to him. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She waited a moment, then knocked again. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open. The old man stood there, his eyes narrowed. "I made some cookies," Katie said, holding out the plate. "I thought you might like some." The man didn't take the plate. Instead, he leaned closer and said in a low voice, "You shouldn't have moved here." Katie froze. "Excuse me?" Katie froze. "You don't belong here," he said. Before she could respond, he slammed the door. That night, Katie told Mark what had happened. "Maybe he's just eccentric," Mark said, trying to calm her down. "Some people are like that." The feeling that the man knew something they didn't. A few days later, Mark went out of town for work, leaving Katie alone in the house. That night, the noises were louder than ever. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth in their backyard. Katie grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. She checked the backyard, but didn't see anything. Just as she was about to go back inside, she noticed something. The gate to the neighbor's yard was open. Against her better judgment, she walked through the gate. The yard was overgrown and littered with junk. She was about to turn back when she noticed a faint light coming from the basement window. Curiosity got the better of her. She crept closer and peeked inside. What she saw made her stomach turn. The basement was filled with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them, filled with what looked like organs floating in some kind of liquid. There were also photos pinned to the walls, photos of people, including Katie and Mark. Katie stumbled back, her heart pounding. She ran back to her house, locked all the doors, and called Mark. "You have to come home," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something seriously wrong with that man." Mark promised he'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, Katie barely slept. Every noise made her jump. Around 3 a.m., she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of her back door open. She grabbed her closet, dialing. "There's someone in my house," she whispered. The operator assured her that police were on their way, but Katie could hear footsteps getting closer. She held her breath, clutching a pair of scissors she had grabbed earlier. The footsteps stopped right outside the closet door. "Katie," a voice whispered. It was the doorknob rattled, and Katie screamed. Just then, she heard sirens outside. The footsteps retreated, and moments later, the police burst into the house. The police searched the neighbor's house and made a horrifying discovery. The jars in the basement were real, and they contained human remains. The man had been a recluse for years, and several people in the area during that time. They also found a list with Katie and Mark's names on it. The police believed the man had been planning to add them to his collection. Mark returned, then the couple decided to sell the house immediately. They never found out exactly why the neighbor had targeted them, but they didn't care. They just wanted to leave. Even after they moved, Katie couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she heard footsteps outside. Even after they moved, she never went to look. Katie and Mark moved, finding refuge in a small apartment complex that had security cameras and neighbors close by. Though the new place felt safer, the trauma of what they had experienced lingered like a shadow over their lives. For weeks after the move, Katie found herself double-checking every lock, peeking out the windows whenever she heard a noise and jumping at the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Mark tried his best to comfort her, reminding her that they were far from that dreadful house and the neighbor who had tormented them. But Katie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as she was unpacking a box of their belongings, she found an old photograph that she didn't remember packing. Her breath caught in her throat as she examined it. It was a picture of her and Mark, taken at their old house. They were standing on the porch, smiling on the day they moved in. But there was something wrong. In the background, through one of the windows, she could see the silhouette of a man. "Katie, what's wrong?" Mark asked, walking into the room. She showed him the photo, her hands trembling. "That's impossible," Mark said, frowning. "We didn't take this photo, and even if we did, why would he be?" Katie felt a cold chill run down her spine. Over the next few days, more unsettling things happened. Katie started noticing items in their apartment being moved or misplaced. She would leave her keys on the counter, only to find them on the coffee table later. A mug she distinctly remembered washing would show up in the sink, dirty. At first, she thought it was her imagination, or that Mark was simply moving things without realizing it. But one night, she woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's just the wind, Katie. Go back to sleep." But Katie knew what she had heard. The next morning, she found a single muddy footprint in the hallway, leading from the front door to the living room. She showed it to Mark, but he dismissed it as something she had tracked in earlier. "I think you're still on edge from everything that happened," he said. "You need to relax." Katie wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. A week later, Katie was going through the mail when she found an envelope with no return address. She opened it, her hands shaking. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words written in shaky handwriting. "You can't escape me." She dropped the letter as though it had burned her. Mark was furious when she showed him. "This has to be a prank," he said. "Maybe some sick kid who heard about what happened." But Katie wasn't convinced. She could feel the weight of the neighbor's presence again, like a dark cloud hanging over her. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. Katie started noticing a figure lingering at the edge of the apartment complex's parking lot at night. He was always too far away for her to see his face, but she was sure it was the neighbor. Mark insisted she was imagining things. "He's probably still in jail," he said. "And even if he's not, there's no way he knows where we live." But Katie wasn't so sure. She started carrying pepper spray everywhere she went and made Mark install extra locks on the doors. One night, as she was coming home from the grocery store, she saw the figure again. This time, he was standing closer, near one of the streetlights. For a brief moment, the light illuminated his face. It was. Katie dropped her bags and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. The next night, Katie and Mark were sitting in the living room when they heard a loud crash. It came from the bed. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and motioned for Katie to stay behind him as they crept toward the room. When they opened the door, they found the window shattered and glass scattered across the floor. "He's here," Katie whispered, her voice trembling. But once more, there was no sign of the man. That night, Katie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, clutching the pepper spray, her ears straining to catch any sound. Around 2 a.m. she heard it, the creak of a floorboard just outside their bedroom door. "Mark," shaking him awake. Mark sat up, grabbing the bat. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the silhouette of the neighbor. His eyes glinted in the darkness, and he was holding a large knife. Katie screamed as Mark lunged at the man with the bat. The two struggled, knocking over furniture and lamps. Katie grabbed her phone and called, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. Mark managed to knock the knife out of the neighbor's hand, but the man was unnaturally strong. Just as it seemed he was gaining the upper hand, the sound of sirens filled the air. The neighbor froze, his eyes narrowing at Katie. "This isn't over," he hissed before turning and bolting out the window. The police searched the area but couldn't find him. They promised to increase patrols around the apartment, but Katie and Mark knew they couldn't stay there. They moved again, this time to a gated community with 24-hour security. Months passed without any sign of the neighbor, but Katie still couldn't relax. Every creak, every shadow, every unfamiliar face made her heart race. One day she received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single jar, filled with a murky liquid. Floating inside was a photograph of her and Mark, taken at their new home. Katie dropped the jar, screaming as it shattered on the floor. She knew then that no matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, he would always find them. Katie and Mark were now living in constant fear, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The jar had been the final straw. They reported it to the police, but there were no fingerprints, no leads, and no evidence tying it to the neighbor. The officers tried to reassure them, but their words felt hollow. The couple knew the man was out there, waiting, watching, and plotting his next move. Mark took time off work, determined to protect Katie and figure out a solution. He began installing more security measures in their new home. Cameras, motion detectors, reinforced locks, and even a panic room in their basement. He also bought a gun, something he had always been against, but now felt. Katie, however, wasn't coping as well. She stopped going outside altogether, too afraid to step beyond the walls of their home. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, and every shadow in the house seemed to hide. One night, Mark found her sitting in the corner of their bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to kill us, Mark." Mark knelt beside her, holding her tightly. "I won't let that happen," he said. "We'll find him, Katie. We'll make sure he can't hurt us anymore." Mark became obsessed with tracking the neighbor down. He spent hours online searching for any information about the man. The police hadn't been able to find him, but Mark refused to believe he had disappeared without a trace. He found old newspaper articles about their previous neighborhood. Buried in the archives was a story about a series of disappearances from decades earlier. The victims were all young couples, and the disappearances had stopped suddenly, with no explanation. One of the articles mentioned the neighbor's name, Gerald Crow. He had been a suspect at the time, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. The articles also mentioned that Crow had inherited the house from his father, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Mark dug deeper, finding more unsettling details. Gerald had been a recluse for most of his life, rarely leaving his home. Neighbors had described him as odd and creepy, but no one had ever truly gotten to know him. The most chilling discovery came from a blog post written by someone who had grown up in the area. The writer claimed that Gerald's father had been involved in occult practices and that Gerald had continued the tradition. After his death, Mark didn't want to believe it, but everything he had seen, the jars, the photographs, the way Gerald always seemed to know where they were, made it hard to dismiss. One night, Mark told Katie his idea. "We can't keep running," he said. "If the police can't find him, then I'll have to do it myself." Katie stared at him, horrified. "Are you insane? He's dangerous, Mark. What if he—" Mark cut her off. "I won't let him hurt you, Katie, I promise. But we can't live like this anymore. I'll find him, and I'll make sure he can't come after us again." Katie tried to talk him out of it, but Mark was determined. He started gathering supplies, flashlights, tools, and even a taser, preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. Mark decided to start at the source, the house where Gerald had lived. It had been abandoned after Gerald fled, but Mark was certain there were clues left behind. Katie refused to let him go alone, despite her fear. "If you're doing this, then I'm coming with you," she insisted. They drove back to their old neighborhood under the cover of darkness. The sight of the decrepit house sent chills down Katie's spine, but she steeled herself and followed Mark inside. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and decay. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet. They made their way to the basement, where the jars and photographs had been found. Most of the shelves were empty now, but Mark noticed something strange, a hatch in the floor that he hadn't seen. He pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Katie whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded. "If he's hiding something, it's down there." The staircase led to a hidden chamber, lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was an altar made of stone, surrounded by more jars and candles. Katie felt her stomach turn as she looked around. "What is this place?" Mark didn't answer. His attention was fixed on a table in the corner. On it were more photographs, new ones, taken at their current home. "He's been watching us," Mark said, his voice tight with anger. Before they could react, the sound of footsteps echoed above them. "He's here," Katie whispered, panic rising in her chest. Mark grabbed the taser and motioned for Katie to stay behind him. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. A moment later, Gerald appeared, his face twisted into a sinister smile. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and menacing. Mark didn't hesitate. He lunged at Gerald with the taser, but the man moved faster than he expected, dodging the attack and knocking the device out of Mark's hand. The two men grappled, their struggle knocking over shelves and sending jars crashing to the floor. Katie grabbed one of the broken jars and smashed it against Gerald's head, giving Mark the opening he needed. He tackled Gerald to the ground, pinning him down. "Call the police," Mark shouted. Katie scrambled for her phone, dialing with shaking hands. Gerald laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You think this is over? You don't understand what you've..." Before Mark could respond, Gerald suddenly went limp. His eyes rolled back, and his body began to convulse. Katie and Mark watched in horror as his skin turned gray, and his body seemed to wither before their eyes, as though something was draining the life out of him. Within moments, he was nothing but a pile of ash. When the police arrived, they found no trace of Gerald, except for the ash. The officers were skeptical of Katie and Mark's story but couldn't explain what had happened. The house was sealed off, and the couple was advised to move on with their lives. But Katie and Mark knew the truth. Gerald's evil had been tied to that house, and by confronting him there, they had broken whatever dark power he had held over them. Though they never saw him again, the experience left a permanent scar. Katie and Mark spent the rest of their lives trying to forget the horrors they had endured, but the memory of Gerald Crow and the terrible things he had done would haunt them forever. After the nightmare at the old house, Katie and Mark decided they couldn't let fear control their lives any longer. They left the town entirely, moving far away to a place where no one knew their story. They chose a small coastal city with bright open spaces and a fresh sea breeze, somewhere that felt alive and far removed from the dark, suffocating atmosphere of their past. Mark quit his job and started working remotely, while Katie took up gardening again, something she had loved before their lives had been turned upside down. Slowly, they began to heal. For months, the couple lived in peace. No more strange noises, no jars, no signs of anyone following them. Katie even started sleeping through the night without waking up in terror. One evening, about a year after Gerald Crow's death, Katie and Mark decided to walk along the beach at sunset. The golden light stretched across the waves, and the sound of the ocean calmed Katie in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. As they strolled hand in hand, Katie glanced toward the dunes in the distance. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, a tall man with a scruffy beard, watching them. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, gripping Mark's arm. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, concern filling his voice. Katie blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. The dunes were empty, the sand undisturbed. "Nothing," she said softly, shaking her head. "Just my imagination." Mark squeezed her hand, and they continued. Katie told herself that the figure was a trick of the light, a ghost of her mind rather than the real world. And as the days turned into months and months into years, the memories of Gerald Crow and the horrors they had faced began to fade. She and Mark built a new life together, full of love, laughter, and hope. They never spoke of the jars, the basement, or the old house again. But every so often, when the wind howled late at night or a shadow moved across the window in the corner of her eye, Katie would feel a chill and remember, some nightmares never truly end, she realized, but they don't have to define you. And so, she chose to keep walking forward, hand in hand with Mark, leaving the darkness behind.